The federal government has unveiled its electric vehicle strategy with plans to install 50,000 charging stations in Australian homes. The new pledge is a long way from Scott Morrison's 2019 election attack on Labor that electric vehicles would end the weekend. But critics say that this strategy needs subsidies, tax incentives and minimum fuel standards to be really effective. Behyad Jafari is Chief Executive of the Electric Vehicles Council. Behyad Jafari, welcome back to Breakfast.
Good morning. Thanks for having me on again.
Build it and they will come. That seems to be the government's strategy here with this electric vehicles policy. Roll out more charging stations and that gives people the infrastructure they need to go electric. Will that work?
Look, there's an element of a good plan there. Unfortunately, that's only about 5% of what's needed. Once again, it's a policy that spends a lot of time talking about what the government won't do as opposed to what the government will do. And the two things that they've ruled out, fuel efficiency standards and rebates or tax incentives, are that should be about 80% of a policy. They're the two most important things that are needed in order to transition us away from high petrol prices towards electric vehicles.
Well, the federal government says its strategy will, quote, create the environment for 1.7 million electric vehicles on the road by 2030. That's about 30% of new car sales. Is it clear to you that this policy, as we've seen it, will achieve that?
Look, I'm certainly very ambitious for the future of electric vehicle sales. I wouldn't be doing this job if I wasn't. The concern is with a policy, what the industry is looking for is a sense of certainty that the government's going to take the right steps in order to increase sales. That number could be well above 50% by 2030, and that's where most of the world's going in doing things like banning petrol and diesel vehicles by 2035. What we've seen from the federal government every time is every year they talk about this issue again, they increase that projection a little bit. Last year it was about 22%. Now it's about 30%. Mm-hmm. We don't see any policies attached to it to actually help make that happen. What we're actually seeing is the government has come out and made a few pledges around emissions reduction. And in order for those to be true, their projections for electric vehicle sales need to be higher. So what do? They tweak up those sales projections a little bit and say, look, all this stuff's happening anyway. We don't need to do anything about it. Okay, well, we've got a way to go. I mean, 1.7 million vehicles, you think it could be even higher, but that's 30% of new car sales. At the moment, it's 2021 and registrations of EVs have doubled to 23,000 this year, with hybrid sales pushing 60,000. So that's a long way from 1.7 electric vehicles. And Angus Taylor, to quote the minister, says voluntary adoption basically is the right pathway. Investment will allow people to, quote, choose their preferred type of vehicle, petrol, diesel, hydrogen or electric, and stringent standards, bans or aggressive taxes will limit choice and increase upfront costs. What's your reaction to that? The industry, car makers and every expert has said is that without those stringent standards in place, and they're standards that every developed country in the world but Australia and Russia have in place, without those things, we don't get the latest and greatest technology of vehicles brought to our country in the first place. That's not just electric vehicles. That's also petrol and diesel vehicles that just cost less to run. They're not being bought here, and Australians are missing out on those choices because we don't have those standards. Now, the idea that not putting these things in place increases choice, that's just good spin. The government sort of likes this idea, well, this is voluntary uptake. There's no truth behind any of that. And we know that's the case because this is something that's happening right around the world. And every other country is, they're behaving like adults and they're addressing this one way. And we've got a federal government saying, no, none of that stacks up. We're going to do the opposite of everyone else. Well, actually just do nothing as opposed to what everybody else is doing.
Well, let's talk about the truth versus the spin. I mean, the government points to Australia's success, world leading in solar panels on your roofs, world leading on that front. And the government quotes that as Australians like to get into new technology when they have the chance. Is that a valid comparison? Or, I mean, there were at least state feed-in tariffs in most of Australia for solar uptake. Is that the example the government should be following, some kind of, rebate here?
Look, yeah, solar is an excellent comparison, and it does show, just like with the excitement that we see from Australians for electric vehicles, that Australians love new technologies. They like new energy technologies like electric vehicles and solar panels, except, of course, what we had in those two cases were we did have rebates in place to help people buy them. We did have a national policy in place. We had things like a renewable energy target, a lot of things that were somewhat diminished by this government when they got in, as well as sort of multi-billion-dollar funds like the Australian Renewable Energy Agency and others to actually help propel this. And then after that, consumers took over and that rate of growth has continued. But what's needed for that first sort of 5-10% is that push along to get the market started when it comes to these new technologies, to give an incentive to customers to buy them and for investors to come and build the businesses to help provide them to customers in the first place.
So there seems to be this plan, if you're right and others are right, will have two effects. If the government's right, building more charging infrastructure, shoring up the grid so it can take that amount of electricity, being withdrawn from it to support the electric vehicles, that will encourage people to, get on board, and it'll bring the cost of price down as the technology cheapens, and we'll use more of them. But the other part of this, as you referred to in terms of fuel standards, is that car makers have been reluctant to plug EVs into the Australian market, and there were warnings that Australia is becoming a dumping ground for dirty cars. At the moment, they're dumping their dirty vehicles here because we're the only one of the few countries that allow those vehicles to run. So these are kind of dual contesting realities, aren't they?
Yeah, and again, it's the government saying, we're not going to introduce those things, and we believe that we're right to not introduce them. When the car companies, this isn't something they're doing in secret. They're bemoaning this fact, saying, please change the situation so that we can build the business case to bring better vehicles to the Australian market. Because you're absolutely right. It's not about becoming a dumping ground. We already are one. The rest of the developed world has these standards in place, which means that they have to, for petrol and diesel vehicles, essentially standards that just make them cheaper to run, as well as introducing electric vehicles into those markets, while Australia and Australians keep missing out on those choices.
There are, I think, 31 electric vehicle models on sale in Australia at the moment. That's versus about 130 in Europe. Only 14 of those models cost less than $65,000. So, cost is a huge part of this. How much rebate, tax exemption, subsidy, whatever is required, would it take to make them affordable? What's the price point that makes people take the choice to buy a plug-in or a hybrid vehicle?
Well, here's a good opportunity to look at the United Kingdom, which we do a lot of because they're a right-hand drive market, so they're really important for us, right? They started off with something like, in Australian dollars, about $9,000 worth of rebates, and now those rebates are down to about $3,000 or $4,000. So a bit more initially to help get the market started, and they're steadily winding those back. Now something like 20% of the cars they sell in the UK are electric vehicles, and they also have a plan of removing those rebates entirely because they've done the job. They've gotten the market up and running. And similarly, what they get as a result of that is, in that lower price point, in that sort of $30,000 to $60,000 price point, they have about 35 models of electric vehicles available. As you mentioned, we only have 14 models available in that range. So the cars are there. The technology has caught up. There's a lot more options available. It's just Australian consumers who are missing out on it.
But if that's right, then the government's right to some degree, aren't they? If the cars are there in that $30,000 to $60,000 price point, and it's just the infrastructure that's not there, and the government's investing in the infrastructure, doesn't that make their point?
Well, no, it's not that the infrastructure is not there. It's that they've built the cars. It's the business case to decide to bring those cars to Australia in the first place. And that's what's not there at the moment. And without those fuel efficiency standards and without those rebates, saying, well, you're competing with every other country in the world. Why wouldn't we keep sending our better vehicles to those other countries that are doing more on this? And you guys, you can just sit around and wait. You can wait until we're done providing more electric vehicles to people in the UK, in Europe, in North America, really everywhere else. When they've had their fill, then you can get what's left over.
Is the reality that the states and territories will lead this, as they did with rooftop solar? I think New South Wales already has a fairly ambitious EV strategy, so does the ACT. What's the strength of those policies?
That's right. I think New South Wales and the ACT today, they've made an electric vehicle something like $5,000 cheaper to buy. Of course, now a whole range of other states are looking at that and saying we need to catch up. We don't want to miss out to New South Wales and the ACT. Really, this is something that we're seeing, much like in renewable energy more broadly. States are doing out of frustration. I'm saying we recognise this is the federal government's job, but this is an issue that they're repeat offenders on. So we're going to have to step up again and help people in our states be able to move to electric vehicles.
So it sounds like you think this policy is a dud. Is that what you're saying?
I think it addresses about 5% of what's needed, and that 5% of things that it does, it's good. I sort of welcome that. It's just, it is now 2021. We've been waiting 2 years for this policy. every other country put their policies out over a decade ago now, so it's just far too little too late.
So just number 1 and 2 priorities of what the government would need to add to this to make it more than 5%, a lot more than 5%? Is it electric? Is it fuel standards? Is it some kind of rebate to make the cost of a new car more affordable?
Yeah, those two things, fuel efficiency standards and rebates, as I said, they've been in place in the world for well over a decade. They would be about 80% of what's needed. And then, everything else is left after that, and everything else follows after that. The government's ruled out those two things, which, it doesn't leave us much to work with from there.
And one of the concerns for people who don't have much money is that if you mandate a cut-off time for petrol engines, as they are doing in the UK and other places, that doesn't give the people the choice for second-hand cars, for instance, or very cheap new cars. What's your answer to that?
Well, again, this is where the faster that we can get more affordable electric vehicles here and help people buy them through things like those rebates, the faster they enter into the second-hand car market. And then that person on a very low income, they don't have to buy a petrol or diesel vehicle that costs something like about $90 to refuel these days. With $2 a litre petrol prices, it costs about $5 to refuel that vehicle.
Okay.
So again, it's about being able to give more people, particularly low-income people, access to the technology.
Behyad Jafari, thanks very much for joining us.
Thank you.
Behyad Jafari is Chief Executive of the Electric Vehicles Council.